She is a drug addict. My father roared the words, his fist slamming down so hard the heavy oak table actually rattled. His voice echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom, sharp and vicious. I sat perfectly still, listening as the man who was supposed to protect me tried to destroy my life in front of a judge. They handed over sealed medical files they thought would bury me forever and strip away everything my grandmother had left me. But my family had absolutely no idea what I really did for a living, and they were about to find out the hard way. My name is Blair, and I am 34 years old. Until that moment in the Massachusetts probate court, my family thought I was just a tragic failure they could easily step over. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly while toxic people dug their own graves. The air in the courtroom was thick and suffocating. The polished wood and marble floors of the courthouse usually commanded respect, but today, they were the stage for my family's theatrical desperation. My father, Richard, stood at the plaintiff's table. At 62 years old, he still tried to maintain the image of a wealthy, untouchable businessman. He wore a custom navy suit that looked just a little too tight, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his fist down a second time for dramatic effect, making sure everyone in the gallery was paying attention. She is a drug addict, he repeated, his voice vibrating with manufactured grief and righteous indignation. She is mentally unfit to be the executor of my mother's estate. It is a tragedy, Your Honor, a deep family tragedy. But we cannot let an unstable substance abuser manage $12 million. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply looked down at my hands and slowly adjusted the crisp white cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. My breathing was even. My heart rate was steady. In my line of work, panic is a liability. I let the silence stretch out, allowing my father's hysterical echo to hang in the air. The contrast between his screaming and my absolute stillness was stark. Behind him, sitting in the first row of the gallery, was my younger sister, Madison. She was 31, dressed in an understated but incredibly expensive black designer dress, playing her part to perfection. As our father shouted about my supposed addiction, Madison lifted a tissue to her face, dabbing at eyes that were completely dry. She let out a soft, trembling sniffle, burying her face in her husband's shoulder to hide her lack of actual tears. Her husband, Jamal, wrapped a protective arm around her. Jamal was 33, an African-American man who loved to boast about his high-stakes career as a hedge fund manager. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car, and on his wrist sat a massive, gleaming gold watch. Over Madison's shoulder, Jamal caught my eye. He did not look sad or sympathetic. He looked straight at me with a smug, victorious grin. He was looking at me like I was a minor obstacle that they had just successfully crushed. He thought the $12 million was already sitting in his bank account. They all thought they had won. They thought this probate hearing was going to be a quick, brutal assassination of my character, leaving them free to divide my grandmother Beatrice's estate exactly how they wanted. They had spent weeks laying the groundwork, whispering to relatives, building a narrative that I was a broken, desperate woman who had somehow manipulated a dying 85-year-old woman into handing over the keys to the kingdom. I shifted my gaze to the front of the room. Judge Sylvia Crawford sat high above us, her expression unreadable. She was known for being a strict, no-nonsense judge who despised family squabbles that wasted the court's time. She looked down at my father with a hard, analyzing stare. My father took a dramatic breath, straightening his tie and looking up at the judge with a look of profound, fabricated sorrow. Your Honor, it breaks my heart to stand here today and expose my own daughter's demons to the public record. We tried to help her. We tried everything. But Blair refused our support. She vanished from our lives, spiraling deeper into her addiction. My mother Beatrice was elderly and vulnerable. She was easily manipulated by Blair's lies and pleas for money. I watched my father perform. It was a masterclass in manipulation. If I did not know the truth, if I had not lived the nightmare of being his scapegoat, I might have felt sorry for him. But I knew exactly who Richard was. I knew about the crushing debts he was hiding from the country club crowd. I knew about the desperate panic behind his arrogant facade. His attorney, a slick, fast-talking man who charged by the minute, stood up and smoothed the front of his jacket. He picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope from the table. The envelope was sealed with red tape looking incredibly official and damning. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, holding the envelope up as if it were a loaded weapon. He cleared his throat, making sure the court reporter was ready. "We understand this is a grave accusation, Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with false empathy. "We do not make these claims lightly. To challenge the appointment of an executor requires undeniable proof of incapacity. We know the court requires concrete physical evidence of Miss Blair's severe and ongoing substance abuse." Jamal's grin grew wider. Madison peeked out from behind her tissue, unable to hide the anticipation on her face. My father crossed his arms, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. They were ready for the execution. The lawyer took another step toward the bench, extending his arm to hand the thick envelope up to the judge's clerk. "Your Honor," the lawyer announced, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom, "we have the rehab facility bills right here." "Why do you think Jamal was so confident in the fake documents?" The clerk took the heavy envelope and handed it up to the bench. My father's attorney, a man who clearly loved the sound of his own voice, did not wait for the judge to open it before he began his performance. He keyed a command into his laptop, projecting copies of the documents onto the large monitors mounted around the courtroom. "Your Honor," the attorney announced, pointing dramatically at the screens, "what you see before you are certified admission records and billing statements from Oakwood Serenity Center. These documents detail a disturbing pattern of severe substance abuse and chronic psychiatric instability. They chronicle multiple involuntary holds over the past 3 years." The words echoed off the marble walls, heavy and damning. My own counsel shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, pulling at his collar and wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He leaned close to me, his voice a frantic whisper, asking if any of this was real. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes locked on the monitors, my face a mask of absolute calm. I simply shook my head once. To drive the final nail into my coffin, the opposing counsel called my sister to the stand. Madison walked up the aisle looking like the picture of tragic grace. She clutched a designer tissue, her shoulders trembling with fabricated grief. When asked to detail my supposed descent into addiction, Madison delivered a monologue that belonged on a theater stage. She claimed I showed up at her house in the middle of the night, erratic and desperate for cash. She spun a vivid, agonizing tale about how her diamond tennis bracelet went missing the next morning. She cried openly, describing how hard she and Jamal had tried to save me, only for me to aggressively push them away so I could buy more pills. She painted me as a monster who was draining the family of its emotional and financial resources. The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs of disgust. I could hear the sharp intakes of breath from extended family members sitting in the back rows, their whispered judgments labeling me a disgrace. Jamal sat behind the plaintiff's table, nodding solemnly as his wife wept on the stand. He occasionally bowed his head, playing the role of the supportive, exhausted brother-in-law. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect character assassination. But I do not just look at documents. I dissect them for a living. I hunt financial criminals by reading the spaces between the lines. As I stared at the glaring white letterhead of Oakwood Serenity Center projected on the screen, a cold, sharp smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. To the judge, to my father, to everyone else in the room, it looked like a legitimate high-end medical facility. But I recognized the font. More importantly, I recognized the underlying corporate formatting of the billing invoice attached to the medical records. It was a standard automated template generated by a specific offshore banking portal. I knew this because Oakwood Serenity Center did not exist in any medical registry. It was a shell company registered in Delaware. And I knew exactly who the registered agent for that specific LLC was. It was Jamal. He had used one of his fraudulent investment holding companies to generate fake medical invoices, arrogantly assuming that no one in a county probate court would ever bother to run a federal tax identification check on a hospital bill. My attorney leaned in again, panicking as the overwhelming tide of public opinion turned viciously against us. He urged me to show some emotion, to act defensive, to do anything to combat Madison's tears. I completely ignored him. I picked up my sleek silver pen and slowly, deliberately slid it across my blank legal notepad. The smooth metal gliding over the paper was the only physical reaction I allowed myself. The trap was set. My family had walked right into it, proudly carrying the very evidence that would lock their own cage. From across the aisle, my father watched me closely. Richard expected me to break down. He expected me to scream, to deny the accusations, to stand up and look exactly like the erratic, unhinged addict they were describing to the court. My absolute, unwavering silence was clearly beginning to unnerve him. He shifted his weight, his arrogant posture faltering just a fraction. He shot a quick glance at Jamal, seeking reassurance. Jamal gave him a subtle, confident nod, utterly convinced that their fabricated paperwork was foolproof. Up at the bench, Judge Sylvia Crawford was not looking at the monitors. She was meticulously reviewing the original physical documents pulled from the sealed envelope. She flipped past the initial diagnostic reports, her face devoid of any emotion. She bypassed the itemized billing statements, turning the heavy pages with deliberate precision. The courtroom was still ringing with Madison's theatrical sobs, but the judge tuned it all out entirely. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the tension thickening as the judge's hands suddenly stopped moving. She stared at page 4 for a long, agonizing moment. Her eyes, sharp and fiercely calculating, narrowed into tight slits. She traced a line of printed text with her index finger, stopping abruptly at a specific signature block at the bottom of the page. The silence emanating from the bench became deafening, instantly pulling the attention of the entire room away from Madison. Judge Crawford slowly lowered the document. She looked directly over the rim of the paper, her piercing gaze bypassing her clerk, bypassing the high-priced lawyers, and landing dead center on my father. Judge Crawford slowly reached up and grasped the thick frames of her reading glasses. She pulled them away from her face and let them drop onto the polished mahogany bench. The sharp clack of the heavy frames hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The theatrical sobbing from the gallery instantly ceased. Madison froze in her seat, her designer tissue suspended inches from her dry eyes. Even the court reporter's fingers paused over her stenograph machine, leaving the room in a sudden, breathless vacuum. The courtroom fell so completely dead silent that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead and the distant muffled sound of traffic from the Boston streets outside. Judge Crawford leaned forward, resting her forearms on the high bench. She did not look at the opposing counsel. She did not look at Madison. She completely ignored the stack of fabricated medical bills lying in front of her. Her piercing gaze bypassed everyone else in the room and locked directly onto my father. She stared at him with the chilling intensity of a federal prosecutor about to dismantle a hostile, overconfident witness. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice remarkably low, but carrying a dangerous, razor-sharp edge that demanded absolute attention. "Are you absolutely sure you know what your daughter does for a living?" My father blinked, entirely derailed by the unexpected question. He looked down at his high-priced attorney, silently demanding an objection. But his lawyer was too busy staring nervously at the bench, a fresh bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The lawyer knew Judge Crawford by reputation, and he knew she never asked a question without already holding the devastating answer. Richard puffed out his chest, gripping the edges of the plaintiff's table. He attempted to regain his footing, falling back on the decades of blind arrogance that had always served as his armor. He truly believed his own narrative. He had spent years convincing himself and his country club friends that I was nothing more than a spectacular failure. He scoffed a short, abrasive sound meant to dismiss the judge's inquiry as entirely irrelevant to the proceedings. "She does data entry, Your Honor. She is a glorified clerk who cannot even hold down a basic apartment lease without getting evicted or begging for a handout. That is precisely why we are here today. We must protect my mother's estate from someone with zero financial literacy, no stable career, and a documented history of severe substance abuse. You hold the proof in your hands right now." From his seat in the gallery directly behind my father, Jamal snickered. It was a soft, arrogant sound, but in the dead quiet of the courtroom it carried perfectly. Jamal leaned back against the wooden bench, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive custom suit. He crossed his legs, completely convinced that my father had just nailed the coffin shut on my future. He looked at me with an expression of pure mockery, expecting me to shrink away in shame, expecting me to finally break down under the weight of their coordinated lies. They had all underestimated my capacity for patience. I do not react to provocations. I investigate them, I document them, and then I destroy them. I placed my silver pen down on my legal pad, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the paper. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor, and I stood up. I took my time commanding the space simply by occupying it. I reached up and unbuttoned the center button of my tailored charcoal suit jacket, shifting my posture into one of absolute authority. My lawyer reached out a trembling hand to stop me, murmuring a panicked warning about speaking out of turn and letting him handle the defense. I ignored him entirely. I stepped out from behind the defense table and walked to the center aisle, planting my feet firmly on the polished floor. My father watched me, his smug expression faltering as he realized I was not breaking down. I was not screaming in protest. I was not acting like the erratic, unhinged addict they had just spent an hour describing to the court. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, my face a mask of absolute calculated calm. I looked at Madison, watching the color rapidly drain from her face as she realized my silence was not surrender. I looked at Jamal, whose arrogant grin slowly melted into a look of cautious confusion as I met his gaze without a single ounce of fear. Finally, I looked at my father, holding his stare, until the oppressive silence of the room forced him to look away first. I turned my attention back to the bench, looking directly at Judge Crawford. She did not reprimand me for standing. She did not strike her gavel or order me to sit down. She simply watched me, her hands folded neatly over the forged medical documents Jamal had so foolishly submitted to a court of law. She recognized the demeanor of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My voice, when I finally spoke, did not shake. It was clear, resonant, and echoed with the cold precision of a woman who had spent years dismantling criminals who thought they were untouchable. Actually, Your Honor, I think my father is stuck in the past. Let me clarify what happened 12 years ago. 12 years ago, I was 22 years old. I was a full-time university student carrying a maximum credit load. My father stood in this exact county and told his affluent friends that he was fully funding my education. That was a complete lie. Richard cut me off entirely the day I turned 18. He told me that building character meant building my own credit, so I took him at his word. I took 3 minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on and pay my tuition installments. I scrubbed grease off diner griddles at midnight. I hauled boxes in campus basements before the sun came up. I worked the early morning shift at a coffee shop, attended lectures until mid-afternoon, then waited tables until 10 at night. On weekends, I took overnight inventory shifts at a retail warehouse. I slept an average of 3 hours a night. I drank cheap black coffee until my hands shook just to stay awake through my exams. I was young, desperate, and running my body into the ground to avoid taking out predatory student loans. Eventually, the human body demands a toll. During finals week of my senior year, my heart rate skyrocketed to 190 beats per minute. I collapsed behind the counter of the diner, clutching my chest. I thought I was having a massive heart attack. The paramedics rushed me to the emergency room, but my heart was perfectly healthy. The attending physician diagnosed me with acute exhaustion and a severe panic attack brought on by extreme sleep deprivation and chronic stress. He discharged me with strict orders to rest and gave me a 30-day prescription for a standard low-dose anti-anxiety medication. It was a basic medical intervention to help my nervous system reset after months of running on adrenaline. I filled the prescription, placed the small orange bottle in my bathroom cabinet, and went to sleep for 14 hours. I lived in a cheap apartment, but my father still had a spare key for supposed emergencies. He did not use it to check on my well-being. He used it to snoop. 2 days after my hospital visit, I came home from class to find my apartment door wide open. My father was standing in my tiny kitchen holding that small orange plastic bottle up to the light. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask why his 22-year-old daughter had ended up in the back of an ambulance. He just looked at the medical label, looked at me, and smiled a cold, calculating smile. He found exactly what he needed. The very next evening, he summoned the extended family to his house. He dragged me into the center of his lavish living room in front of aunts, uncles, and my younger sister Madison. Madison stood there with her arms crossed, wearing a designer sweater paid for by his credit cards, watching me with absolute delight as my father held that prescription bottle high in the air like a hunting trophy. He put on the performance of a lifetime. He paced the Persian rug, clutching his chest, performing a monologue about how I had shattered his heart. He cried fake tears. He dramatically proclaimed that his eldest daughter had succumbed to the dark world of addiction. He twisted a legal doctor-prescribed medication for exhaustion into a narrative of reckless, unstable substance abuse. I tried to explain. I brought out my hospital discharge papers showing the panic attack diagnosis and the severe exhaustion warning from the attending physician. He snatched the papers out of my hand and threw them directly into the lit fireplace. He looked me dead in the eye and told the entire family that an addict could not be trusted under his roof or in his family. He gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my belongings and get out. He branded me a junkie to destroy my credibility, ensuring that no one in our family would ever believe a word I said. He made sure I was completely isolated, cut off, and thrown onto the street with nothing but a suitcase. I paused, letting the heavy reality of that night sink into the silent courtroom. Up at the bench, Judge Crawford's expression had turned into a mask of pure granite. She did not blink. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled hands, absorbing every single word. She kept her eyes locked on my father. Richard's face was rapidly losing its color. His confident, arrogant posture was crumbling, replaced by the frantic shifting of a man who suddenly realizes the exits are blocked. In the gallery, Jamal shifted in his seat, the smug grin completely wiped from his face. He leaned forward, whispering frantically to his lawyer. My father loves to talk about addiction. I continued, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the marble room. He loves to paint me as an unstable financial risk who would drain my grandmother's estate. But he left out the true motivation behind his theatrical performance 12 years ago. I turned away from the judge and walked back toward the defense table. I did not rush. I opened my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single protective plastic sleeve. Inside the sleeve was a piece of paper, perfectly preserved and pristine. I turned back to face my father. His eyes widened as he recognized the logo printed at the top of the page. It was a logo from a banking institution he knew intimately. He did not kick me out because of pills, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the courtroom. He did not throw his 22-year-old daughter onto the street to practice tough love or protect the family. I slid the document out of the plastic sleeve and held it high enough for the judge in the gallery to see. He did not kick me out because of pills. He kicked me out because he needed to liquidate my college fund. I held the banking statement high enough for the fluorescent lights to catch the official seal. The document was dated exactly 12 years ago, printed 2 days after my father staged his dramatic intervention in our living room. I turned the page toward the bench so Judge Crawford could see the highlighted columns. As a forensic auditor, I track the movement of hidden money for the federal government. But my very first investigation was my own family. When you follow the money, the truth always rises to the surface. The account my father liquidated was a custodial college savings fund set up when I was a child. The balance on the morning he kicked me out was exactly $40,215. He had unrestricted access until my 23rd birthday. By kicking me out at 22 under the guise of severe addiction, he ensured I was entirely cut off from legal and financial resources. He marched into his local bank branch, claimed he was closing the account to protect a troubled child from buying drugs, and wired the entire balance into his personal checking account. He did not use a single cent to pay for the fake rehabilitation center he just presented to this court. He did not use it to help me. Instead, within 48 hours of that transfer, the $40,000 was meticulously dispersed to 3 specific vendors. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out 3 certified wire transfer receipts, placing them side by side on the plaintiff's table. The first wire was for $18,000, sent directly to a luxury country club. The second wire for $15,000 was transferred to an elite bridal boutique in Manhattan. The final wire covered premium catering and a tiered wedding cake. My father did not kick me out to protect the family. He kicked me out because he was already drowning in his own hidden debt and he needed a scapegoat to fund his golden child's perfect day. He stole my education to pay for Madison and Jamal's extravagant wedding. A loud gasp rippled through the gallery. The entire courtroom turned to look at the second row where my sister was sitting. Madison's face turned a violent shade of crimson. Her carefully constructed image of the grieving, supportive sister shattered in an instant. She gripped the wooden pew in front of her, her knuckles turning white. "That is a lie!" Madison screamed from the gallery, completely abandoning courtroom decorum. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. "You are making this up. You were living on the streets because you were a junkie. You chose drugs over us." The bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting on his utility belt, ready to remove her from the room. Beside her, Jamal was not screaming. Jamal was not defending his wife. The smug, victorious grin he had worn since the hearing began had completely vanished, replaced by a sickening pale shade of gray. As a man who ran a fraudulent investment firm, Jamal knew exactly what a certified bank wire trace looked like. He recognized the heavy, irrefutable weight of a federal paper trail. Jamal grabbed Madison by the arm, pulling her down forcefully into her seat. He hissed something in her ear, his eyes darting nervously toward the judge and then back to the stack of receipts I had placed on the table. He was sweating. He realized in that exact moment that I did not just bring accusations to this courtroom. I brought receipts. And if I had the banking receipts from 12 years ago, Jamal was terrified of what else I might have in my briefcase. I did not even look at my sister. Her screaming meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I kept my eyes locked on my father. Richard was standing completely frozen behind his table. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The arrogant, wealthy businessman persona had dissolved, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered thief. While you were standing at that country club, raising a glass of expensive champagne and giving a toast about family values and your beautiful daughter's future, I was freezing. I spoke directly to Richard, my voice cold and hollow, stripping away every ounce of his dignity. While Madison was dancing in a $15,000 dress, paid for by my college fund, I was carrying everything I owned in a black garbage bag. You stole my future to buy her a status symbol. I turned away from my father and looked up at the bench. Judge Crawford extended her hand. The bailiff quickly walked over, collected the bank statement and the wire transfer receipts from my table, and handed them up to the judge. Judge Crawford put her glasses back on. She reviewed the documents in absolute silence. The courtroom held its collective breath. We watched her eyes scan the dates, the amounts, and the receiving vendors. Her jaw tightened. The expression on her face shifted from professional skepticism to pure, unadulterated disgust. She lowered the documents and glared at Richard with a look so lethal it could have cut glass. I looked at the judge, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 12 years finally beginning to lift off my shoulders. I was homeless for 3 months, I said, my voice steady and unwavering in the quiet room. But I was not entirely alone. Someone else knew the truth. The winter of that year was brutally cold. I spent my days rotating between public libraries and cheap coffee shops, applying for any job that did not require a background check or a permanent physical address. I slept in a 24-hour transit station until a security guard took pity on me and let me stay in a utility closet. I was hungry, exhausted, and completely shattered by the absolute cruelty of the people who were supposed to protect me. Then came a rainy Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting in a rundown diner on the edge of the city, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee just to keep my claim on the table. The bell above the door chimed. I did not look up until a very familiar, very expensive perfume cut through the smell of stale grease and wet coats. It was my grandmother, Beatrice. She did not look at me with pity. She did not look at me with the manufactured disgust my father had so carefully orchestrated for the rest of the family. She slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, her posture perfectly straight, her sharp eyes scanning my exhausted face and my worn-out coat. "You look terrible, Blair," she said, her tone completely matter-of-fact. "But you certainly do not look like a junkie." I tried to speak, but my throat was tight with a sudden overwhelming wave of emotion. Beatrice simply raised a single elegantly manicured hand to stop me. She did not need me to explain. She told me she had hired a private investigator the very morning after my father kicked me out. She had not believed his theatrical weeping display in the living room for a single second. Beatrice was a woman who had built her own formidable wealth from the ground up after my grandfather passed away. She knew a con artist when she saw one, even when that con artist happened to be her own son. She leaned across the sticky diner table and told me exactly what her investigator had found. She knew Richard was drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. She knew he had liquidated my custodial college fund to pay for Madison and Jamal's extravagant wedding. She looked me dead in the eye and stated plainly that my father was a narcissistic fraud. He was a man using his own children as financial shields to mask his spectacular failures. Then she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She slid it across the table until it rested right next to my coffee cup. Inside was a cashier's check. It was an amount large enough to secure a lease on a safe, quiet apartment and cover my basic living expenses for 6 months. But more importantly, she had calculated the exact costs of the registration fees, the intensive preparation courses, and the study materials for the certified public accountant exams. "I am not giving you a handout, Blair," she told me, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am making an investment. Your father took your education. He took your reputation. He took your safety. Now you are going to learn the language of money, and you are going to make yourself completely untouchable." From that day forward, my grandmother and I formed a secret, unbreakable alliance. To the rest of the world, to my father, to Madison, and to Jamal, I remained the tragic outcast. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about at holiday dinners to make themselves feel superior. They spent 12 years patting themselves on the back, completely convinced they had successfully buried me and silenced my future. They had absolutely no idea that while they were spending money they did not possess to impress country club members they did not even like. Beatrice was quietly funding my rapid rise through the federal financial certification ranks. She paid for my advanced forensic accounting modules. She sponsored my specialized training seminars. We met in secret far away from the family estates in quiet cafes or secure office buildings. She would review my test scores and my certification letters, her eyes gleaming with fierce pride. Beatrice knew exactly what kind of weapon she was forging. She knew that Richard's greed was a bottomless pit. She knew that eventually he, Madison, and Jamal would try to sink their claws into her massive estate. She knew she needed an executor who could not be bullied, bought, or emotionally manipulated. She needed someone who knew exactly how to track every single stolen dime hidden behind their fake corporate entities. I looked at my father, now standing paralyzed behind the plaintiff's table in the courtroom. The devastating realization was finally hitting him. He was not just fighting me today, he was fighting the ghost of his own mother. He realized in real time that Beatrice had seen entirely through his pathetic, wealthy businessman facade for over a decade. She had played him perfectly, letting him believe he was the master of the family, while she secretly handed the keys of the kingdom to the daughter he threw away. Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray. His jaw hung slack. The sheer magnitude of his own mother's betrayal left him gasping for air. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I bypassed the thick stacks of banking evidence and pulled out a single heavy piece of personalized stationery. The paper was slightly yellowed, carrying the distinct gold watermark of my grandmother's personal desk. "This is not a financial document," I announced, my voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. I held the letter up so the judge could see the familiar, elegant handwriting. "This is a personal letter my grandmother wrote to me exactly 1 year before she passed away. She handed it to me on the day I received my senior federal credentials." I unfolded the heavy paper. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the bailiff stood perfectly still, captivated by the unraveling of my father's entire existence. I looked directly at Jamal, then at Madison, and finally at my father. I read my grandmother's final words to me aloud. "Let them think you are nothing, Blair. The wolf never barks before it bites." I folded my grandmother's letter with precise, deliberate movements and slid it back into my briefcase. The silence in the courtroom was absolute heavy with the realization of what my family had just unleashed. They had expected a chaotic, desperate woman to show up and beg for scraps. They had no idea they had summoned a predator. For 12 years, I was a ghost. I did not exist on social media. I deleted every account, changed my phone number, and completely severed any traceable ties to the people sitting in this room. I never checked in. I never sent a holiday card. I never asked for a single favor. My father and my sister assumed I was dead in jail, or living on the streets too ashamed to show my face. The reality was far more dangerous for them. I was in a windowless room studying federal tax law, while they were busy attending country club galas and taking out high-interest loans to maintain their illusion of wealth. I was building an impenetrable fortress of credentials. I earned my master's degree in accounting with highest honors. I sat for the grueling certified public accountant exams and passed them on the first try. But I did not stop there. I wanted the ultimate weapon in financial warfare. I spent 2 years undergoing rigorous background checks, intensive training, and exhaustive testing to become a certified fraud examiner. I did not just balance ledgers. I learned how to track hidden money across international borders. I started contracting with the Internal Revenue Service and federal task forces. I was handed cases involving white-collar criminals, corrupt politicians, and corporate executives who thought they were smarter than the government. I tracked phantom LLCs, shell corporations, and laundered assets hidden in offshore accounts. I learned how to find the invisible threads of stolen money and pull them until entire empires unraveled. My grandmother Beatrice kept me informed of everything happening back home. I knew exactly what my family was doing during those ghost years. Every Thanksgiving, Richard would sit at the head of his massive dining table, carving a turkey he bought on a maxed-out credit card. He would raise a glass of expensive wine and boast to the extended family about his brilliant son-in-law. Jamal would sit there wearing a custom-tailored suit, swirling a glass of bourbon. Jamal loved to play the part of a Wall Street titan. He would talk endlessly about his proprietary hedge fund algorithms, his high-yield returns, and his exclusive circle of wealthy investors. He drove leased luxury cars to family dinners and spoke down to anyone who did not understand complex market dynamics. They mocked my absence, toasting to their own manufactured greatness and the incredible financial legacy they were supposedly building. While Jamal was playing a billionaire in my father's living room, I was sitting in a highly secured federal building in Washington, staring at dual monitors until my eyes burned. I was eating stale sandwiches at 2 in the morning, ripping apart real financial syndicates. I was tearing down men who were 10 times smarter and 100 times wealthier than Jamal could ever hope to be. During those long, silent nights, I learned a very specific, very ruthless skill. I learned how to entirely dismantle a human being's life using nothing but spreadsheets and wire transfer routing numbers. I realized that arrogant men all make the exact same fatal mistakes. They get greedy, they get sloppy, and they always leave a paper trail. I learned that wealth is often an illusion, but numbers are absolute, undeniable truth. Now standing in this courtroom, the illusion my family had carefully maintained for over a decade was shattering into a million pieces. My father was already bleeding out from the truth of the stolen college fund. Madison was clutching her chest in the gallery, hyperventilating as her entire reality collapsed. But Jamal still thought he was insulated. He still thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He sat in the gallery, his arms crossed, trying to project an air of bored indifference. He thought this probate hearing was just a messy, emotional family squabble over a house and a few local bank accounts. He thought my expertise was limited to catching low-level embezzlement or standard tax evasion. He thought his offshore accounts were buried far too deep for a county court to ever discover. I stepped away from the plaintiff's table and walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I stopped right in front of the wooden barrier separating the court from the gallery, standing directly in front of where Jamal was seated. I looked at him. I looked at the smug, dismissive expression he was trying so desperately to maintain. I looked at the heavy gold watch on his wrist and the silk pocket square in his jacket. I let him feel the full crushing weight of my attention. The air in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Crawford watched me intently from the bench, recognizing the exact moment a federal auditor corners their target. I tilted my head slightly, my voice dropping to a calm conversational tone that carried perfectly through the dead silent room. Speaking of hedge funds, Jamal, how is the Cayman Islands portfolio doing this quarter? Jamal dropped his pen. The sharp clatter of Jamal dropping his gold pen onto the defense table brings me immense satisfaction. He knows. He knows I see right through his offshore shell game. But to fully understand the absolute suffocating panic radiating from my brother-in-law in this courtroom right now, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back exactly 3 weeks. Back to the day we buried Beatrice, the only person in my family who possessed a single shred of human decency. It was a damp, overcast morning in Boston, the kind of dreary New England day that perfectly mirrored the somber nature of a funeral. But for my father, this was not a day of mourning. It was a high society networking event. He turned his own mother's burial into a stage production for his country club associates. I stood in the back of the manicured cemetery, intentionally hiding myself beneath the drooping branches of an ancient oak tree. I wore a sharp, simple black trench coat, keeping my distance as I watched a fleet of gleaming luxury vehicles pull up to the graveside. My father stepped out of a rented Mercedes, immediately shaking hands with local politicians and pretending to wipe away invisible tears. Madison and Jamal arrived next, stepping out of an Aston Martin they absolutely could not afford. They coordinated their performance flawlessly. Madison wore a heavy black veil to hide her dry eyes, clutching a designer handkerchief and letting out perfectly timed, fragile sobs whenever a camera flash went off. Jamal played the supportive husband, keeping a protective arm around her waist, projecting the image of a wealthy, grieving family unit. But the moment they thought the cameras were gone and the important guests were out of earshot, the performative grief instantly evaporated. From my vantage point in the shadows, I watched them huddle near the massive floral arrangements, whispering frantically. They were not sharing fond memories of the woman who raised them. They were acting like starving vultures circling a fresh carcass, actively calculating the liquidation value of a $12 million estate. I distinctly heard my father assure Jamal that the massive stone manor would go on the market by the end of the month. He promised that a massive injection of cash was coming to save Jamal's failing business ventures. I did not approach them. I stayed in the background observing them with the detached analytical precision of a federal investigator mapping out a criminal syndicate. But eventually the crowd of mourners thinned out. Madison spotted me standing quietly by the iron gates. She unlinked her arm from Jamal and marched over her expensive heels, sinking into the wet grass. She looked me up and down with absolute revulsion, treating me like a stray dog that had dared to wander onto a private country club lawn. She leaned in close, the suffocating smell of her heavy floral perfume masking the scent of the damp earth. "Do not try to beg for a handout today," Blair Madison sneered, her voice dropping to a vicious, hateful whisper. "Grandma felt sorry for you, but her charity ends in the grave. You are getting absolutely nothing, so do not even think about causing a scene and embarrassing us in front of these people." Jamal walked up right behind her, sliding his hands into his tailored pockets. He looked at me with that same arrogant, dismissive smirk he wore in the courtroom today. "Take the hint," Blair Jamal added smoothly, his tone dripping with condescension. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. The adults have serious financial matters to handle today." I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against their pathetic insults. I just stared back at them, my face perfectly blank, analyzing the sheer blind confidence of two people walking directly into a slaughterhouse. I let them enjoy their delusion for a few hours longer. After the burial concluded, the immediate family retreated to my grandmother's sprawling historic estate for the private reading of the will. The massive stone house felt entirely empty without Beatrice, but my father was already acting like the new lord of the manor. He stood by the grand marble fireplace in the main study, pouring himself a heavy glass of aged scotch. Madison and Jamal took a seat on the velvet sofa, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. They were already mentally spending money they did not have. I stood silently in the far corner of the room, leaning against a towering mahogany bookshelf. My father glared at me, clearly furious that I had dared to step foot inside the house, but he did not want to cause a screaming match in front of the family attorney. He decided to tolerate my presence, assuming I was just there to receive a token sum of a few $1,000s before being officially banished. Mr. Caldwell, a stern old-school lawyer who had managed Beatrice's affairs for 4 decades, walked into the study. He carried a battered leather briefcase that held the final legally binding wishes of a woman who was infinitely smarter than her greedy son. Mr. Caldwell did not offer any warm pleasantries. He placed his heavy briefcase on the wooden desk, unlatched the brass locks, and pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents. He adjusted his reading glasses, looked down at the very first page of the will, and then slowly raised his head. His eyes bypassed Madison entirely. He completely ignored Jamal. He looked directly across the room at my father, who was swirling the scotch in his crystal glass with a triumphant, expectant grin. Mr. Caldwell let out a heavy sigh, his expression twisting into a tight, deeply uncomfortable grimace. "Richard the lawyer," said, his voice flat and gravely serious in the quiet room, "I suggest you sit down for this." My father did not sit down. He scoffed, taking another arrogant sip of his aged scotch. He genuinely believed that Mr. Caldwell was about to read a few minor, annoying charitable bequests before handing over the keys to the empire. Richard waved his free hand dismissively, telling the lawyer to skip the legal jargon and just get to the bottom line. Madison practically vibrated on the velvet sofa, her eyes wide with unadulterated greed. She leaned into Jamal, whispering loudly about the summer house in Martha's Vineyard and how she planned to completely gut and remodel the kitchen. Jamal rubbed his hands together, his mind already actively embezzling the massive capital injection he desperately needed to keep his fraudulent hedge fund afloat. Mr. Caldwell did not look amused. He adjusted his glasses and began reading from the heavy notarized document. He confirmed the total value of my grandmother's estate, a staggering $12 million, composed of prime real estate liquid assets and highly diversified investment portfolios. Hearing the official number out loud acted like a narcotic on my family. My father closed his eyes and smiled, looking like a man who had just been pardoned by the governor. Then Mr. Caldwell turned to the second page. His voice grew firmer, entirely devoid of sympathy. "To my son Richard," Mr. Caldwell read, enunciating every single syllable perfectly. "I leave absolutely no controlling interest in my estate, my properties, or my financial holdings. I hereby revoke any and all previous powers of attorney." The smug smile slid right off my father's face. The color drained from his cheeks, replaced by a sickly, panicked white. He opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Caldwell simply raised a hand and continued reading without missing a beat. "I hereby name my granddaughter Blair as the sole and absolute executor of my estate. Furthermore, to Blair, I leave 80% of my total assets free and clear of any encumbrances. The remaining 20% is to be placed into a strictly locked, irrevocable trust, which Richard, Madison, and Jamal are legally barred from accessing or managing in any capacity." For exactly 3 seconds, the study was completely devoid of sound. The sheer magnitude of my grandmother's final strike against them was too massive for their narcissistic brains to process. They had spent 12 years treating me like a disease, convincing themselves that I was a broken, useless addict who had vanished into the gutter. Now a legally binding document had just crowned me the absolute ruler of their financial universe. The silence shattered. My father let out a guttural, feral roar. He hurled his heavy crystal glass directly at the stone fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending shards of glass and expensive liquor flying across the Persian rug. He gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white, screaming at Mr. Caldwell that the document was a forgery, a mistake, a sick joke. Madison completely lost her mind. The polished high society facade melted away in an instant. She shrieked a high-pitched, agonizing sound and actually lunged across the room at me. Her hands were curled into claws, her face twisted with a level of pure hatred I had never seen before. Jamal had to grab her around the waist, pulling her back forcefully as she thrashed and kicked against him, screaming that I had poisoned our grandmother's mind. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood by the bookshelf, picked up a porcelain cup of black coffee from a nearby side table, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I watched their psychological collapse with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. They were tearing each other apart, thrashing against the inescapable reality of their own ruin. "You manipulated her!" My father screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You crawled back here and brainwashed a dying woman. I will contest this. I will drag you through every court in this state. I will have you committed." Mr. Caldwell calmly closed his leather folder and latched his briefcase. He looked at my father with profound disgust. I assure you, Richard Beatrice was of exceptionally sound mind. In fact, she had 3 independent medical professionals evaluate her cognitive functions on the very day she signed this document. She anticipated this exact reaction from you. I strongly suggest you hire competent counsel, though I doubt it will do you any good. With that, the lawyer turned on his heel and walked out of the study, leaving us alone in the tense, suffocating aftermath of the explosion. I placed my coffee cup back down on the table. The show was over. I had seen everything I needed to see. I smoothed out the front of my tailored suit, completely ignoring my father's frantic, heavy breathing and Madison's continuous hysterical sobbing. I stepped away from the bookshelf and began walking toward the heavy wooden double doors leading out to the main hallway. I did not make it to the exit. Jamal stepped directly into my path. He moved with a sudden aggressive speed that completely contradicted his usual laid-back, arrogant demeanor. He planted himself squarely in front of the doors, his broad shoulders blocking any chance of me leaving the room. He reached behind his back, grasped the brass deadbolt, and locked the door with a loud, heavy click. He did not look like a smooth-talking hedge fund manager anymore. The expensive suit and the gold watch were just camouflage. As he glared down at me, his eyes dark and menacing, the corporate mask completely slipped away, revealing something cold, desperate, and deeply sinister. The heavy brass deadbolt echoed with a sharp snap that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Jamal leaned his massive frame against the carved mahogany doors, crossing his arms over his chest to block my only exit. His breathing was heavy, slightly erratic, betraying the primal panic hiding just beneath his expensive designer cologne. Across the room, my father was still staring blankly at the shattered crystal in the fireplace, muttering to himself in a state of absolute shock. On the velvet sofa, Madison clutched her head, rocking back and forth as her dreams of a summer home evaporated into thin air. They were completely useless. Jamal knew he had to handle this himself. He pushed off the wood and took a slow, deliberate step toward me. He was easily a foot taller than I was, a broad-shouldered man who was entirely accustomed to using his physical size to force people into submission. He walked directly into my personal space, standing so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. He angled his head down, casting a dark shadow over me, trying to force me to look up at him, like a frightened, obedient child. I did not back away. I did not shift my weight or lower my eyes. I held my ground perfectly, letting him loom over me while I maintained the exact same detached analytical expression I used when interrogating hostile corporate executives for the federal government. I knew exactly what a desperate man looked like, and Jamal was bleeding desperation from every pore. "Listen to me, little girl." Jamal lowered his voice to a gravelly, threatening whisper, intending to intimidate me into a total psychological surrender. "My firm needs a $3 million liquidity injection by Friday. Richard promised me Beatrice's estate. You are going to sign a renunciation form, and I'll throw you $50,000 to go away quietly." He spoke with the absolute blind arrogance of a man who genuinely believed his own lies. He thought he was offering me a lifeline. He was entirely convinced that throwing $50,000 at a woman he considered a broke recovering addict would be more than enough to buy my compliance and secure his stolen empire. He leaned in closer, waiting for me to tremble, waiting for me to eagerly accept the bribe and run away from the confrontation so he could save his failing hedge fund from absolute ruin. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I just let a long, agonizing silence stretch between us. I let him feel the absolute lack of fear in my posture. I wanted him to understand that his physical intimidation meant absolutely nothing to me. Then, very slowly, I lowered my gaze. I did not look at his face. I did not look at his threatening shoulders. I looked directly at his left wrist, which was resting aggressively near his waistline. Peeking out from beneath the crisp white cuff of his tailored shirt was a heavy, gleaming gold watch. It was designed to project absolute wealth, success, and dominance. It was the flashy centerpiece of his Wall Street Titan costume, an accessory meant to convince investors that he was a man who handled millions of dollars before breakfast. "Is that a Daytona Rolex, Jamal?" I asked, my voice completely flat and conversational, slicing through his aggressive posturing like a scalpel. Funny, the sweeping hand is ticking. Real Rolexes glide. They don't tick. The air rushed out of Jamal's lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. His dark eyes widened in absolute shock. The aggressive, towering stance collapsed instantly. He actually took a physical step backward, pulling his left arm behind his back, as if the watch had suddenly caught fire. The psychological impact of that single observation hit him harder than a physical blow to the chest. In 3 short sentences, I had completely stripped away his entire identity. I had looked right past the intimidation, right past the expensive suit, and identified him as exactly what he was: a cheap, desperate fraud wearing fake gold. Across the room, Madison stopped rocking. My father finally turned away from the fireplace. They watched in stunned silence as the man who was supposed to be their financial savior stumbled backward away from me, completely rattled and entirely out of his depth. Jamal opened his mouth to defend himself, to spin another lie to try and regain the upper hand, but he had absolutely nothing left in his arsenal. His chest heaved. A visible bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. He realized in that agonizing moment that I was not a victim. I was not a terrified outcast who could be bullied into submission. He was standing in a locked room with a predator who noticed every single detail, every discrepancy, and every lie. I stepped right into the space he had just retreated from. I squared my shoulders, staring him dead in the eye with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. "If you ever try to trap me in a room again, I won't just take your money. I'll take your freedom." The heavy mahogany doors of my grandmother's study swung shut behind me, leaving Jamal frozen in his cheap suit, and my father staring blankly at the ruins of his shattered crystal glass. I did not look back. I simply walked out the front door, climbed into my SUV, and drove away from the sprawling estate. I knew the explosion was coming. You cannot back a family of narcissists into a corner, strip away their $12 million fantasy, and expect them to surrender quietly. They operate entirely on attention, on public validation, and on controlling the narrative. Deprived of the inheritance they had already mentally spent, they immediately turned to the only weapon they had left: character assassination. Within 48 hours of the will reading, my sister went absolutely nuclear. Madison did exactly what any entitled, financially ruined golden child would do. She took out her smartphone, positioned her expensive ring light perfectly, and began broadcasting her fabricated trauma to the entire world. The videos appeared across every major social media platform, meticulously designed to generate maximum outrage. In the footage, she sat on her plush velvet sofa wearing an oversized sweater and no makeup to look appropriately distressed. She squeezed out highly orchestrated tears, sobbing to her thousands of followers about a sudden, devastating family tragedy. She did not mention her husband's fake gold watch or my father's crippling business debts. Instead, she spun a terrifying, malicious tale about her estranged, severely mentally unstable older sister. Madison stared directly into the camera lens and claimed I was a violent drug addict who had crawled back from the streets. She told her audience that I had somehow bypassed the estate's security, cornered our dying grandmother, and manipulated a frail, confused 85-year-old woman into changing her legal will. She weaponized buzzwords perfectly, crying about elder abuse, psychiatric coercion, and financial exploitation. She begged her followers to pray for her family as they fought to protect their grandmother's true legacy from a vicious, addicted predator. The videos went viral almost instantly. The comment sections flooded with absolute strangers, offering sympathy to Madison and demanding that I be investigated by the authorities. The digital mob was exactly the spark the extended family needed to ignite their own outrage. My phone began vibrating nonstop. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins who had not spoken a single word to me in 12 years suddenly found my contact information. The notifications rolled in like rapid-fire artillery. They demanded I step down as the executor immediately. They called me a disgrace, a thief, and a sociopath. One uncle left a blistering voicemail accusing me of stealing his rightful share of the estate and threatening to show up at my apartment to teach me a lesson. Another aunt sent a massive block of text demanding I sign a renunciation form before the family filed a collective lawsuit to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. They fed on Madison's lies, eager to participate in the destruction of the family scapegoat. My father, realizing that social media tears were not enough to legally break a bulletproof trust, decided to escalate the campaign. He needed to establish a public record of my supposed insanity to leverage in probate court. Richard began doing exclusive interviews with local high society gossip blogs and financial podcasts. He played the role of the heartbroken patriarch to perfection. He claimed he had spent the last decade trying to save me from the dark, destructive grip of severe addiction, painting himself as a long-suffering martyr. He told reporters that I harbored a deep, psychotic vendetta against the family because they had tried to force me into rehabilitation. He publicly declared that his mother, Beatrice, had suffered from severe dementia in her final months, completely ignoring the absolute fact that she had passed 3 rigorous cognitive evaluations on the exact day she signed her will. My own legal counsel called me in a sheer panic. He begged me to release a public statement to hire a crisis management firm or to at least post a rebuttal on my own social media accounts. He warned me that the court of public opinion could heavily influence a judge if my father actually managed to file an emergency injunction to halt the probate process. I told my lawyer to take a breath and do absolutely nothing. I refused to engage in a public screaming match. I refused to defend myself against people who relied on cheap theatrics and burner accounts. Let them scream. Let Madison post 100 more tearful videos. Let my father give 1,000 interviews about his tragic addicted daughter. They were fighting a war of public relations, relying on the court of public opinion to bully me into submission. They thought shame would force me to hand over the estate. I was not fighting a public relations war. I was fighting a war of federal compliance. I ignored the hundreds of hateful text messages flooding my screen. I silenced my phone and tossed it onto the kitchen counter, letting the screen flash wildly in the dark. I walked into my home office, locked the solid core door, and pulled down the heavy blackout blinds. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and reached for my primary weapon. I opened my encrypted government-issued laptop. The screen glowed to life, casting a harsh blue light across my face in the darkened room. I bypassed the standard security protocols, utilizing my senior clearance to access the highly restricted federal financial database. I did not need to win an argument in the comment section of a viral social media post. I did not need to justify my existence to aunts and uncles who had gladly watched me freeze on the streets 12 years ago. I needed to find the exact coordinates of my father and my brother-in-law's financial arteries. I pulled up the search portal. I typed in my father's full legal name and the primary employer identification number for his supposedly thriving corporate enterprise. Next, I opened a second window and entered the registration details for Jamal's flashy offshore limited liability company. I hit the execute key and watched the progress bar flash across the screen as the federal algorithms began pulling years of hidden banking data. I was no longer the frightened 22-year-old girl they had thrown onto the street. I was a forensic auditor with unrestricted access to their deepest, darkest secrets, and the hunt had officially begun. The progress bar on my federal database terminal crawled from left to right, illuminating the dark walls of my home office with a harsh clinical glare. In my line of work, we have a saying: men can lie, cry, and orchestrate brilliant public relations campaigns, but numbers possess absolute, unyielding integrity. As the decrypted banking files began cascading down my screen, the meticulously crafted illusion of my father's wealth shattered into 1,000 worthless pieces. Richard was not just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem, he was standing on the precipice of absolute financial annihilation. I opened the first ledger, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted corporate filings. His primary manufacturing firm, the one he boasted about at every single country club dinner, was a hollow, decaying shell. He had taken out 3 separate, highly leveraged mortgages on his sprawling suburban estate. He had maxed out every single corporate line of credit available to him. The business was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, completely unable to meet its basic operational payroll. According to the debt-to-asset ratios flashing red on my monitor, Richard was exactly 3 weeks away from a mandatory Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. But the desperation went much deeper than bad business management. I cross-referenced his personal checking accounts with the company's operating funds. I found a series of erratic, highly illegal transfers. He was siphoning money directly out of his own employees' pension plans just to keep up his country club dues and lease payments on his luxury vehicles. He was a cornered animal staring down the barrel of federal embezzlement charges. I opened a second encrypted window and fed Jamal's offshore limited liability company into the federal tracking algorithm. Madison's husband loved to parade around playing the role of an elite hedge fund manager. But the data painting the screen told a remarkably different story. The Cayman Islands portfolio he constantly bragged about was a total ghost town. There were 0 legitimate investments, no stocks, no bonds, no real estate acquisitions. The only money entering the accounts came from new, unsuspecting investors. And that exact same money was instantly wired back out to pay off the older investors demanding their quarterly returns. Jamal was not a financial prodigy. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme, and his fraudulent house of cards was collapsing in real time. The deficit was massive, hovering right around $4 million. They were not attacking me on social media because they wanted to preserve my grandmother's legacy. They were attacking me because they were staring at $12 million as their one and only ticket to avoid federal prison. While I sat in the safety of my locked office documenting their crimes bite by bite, a very different scene was unfolding across town. The arrogant swagger my father and brother-in-law displayed at the funeral had completely evaporated. They were meeting in the dimly lit private study of my father's heavily mortgaged estate. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the streetlights. Richard paced the length of the Persian rug, his tie loosened, a glass of cheap bourbon shaking in his hand. The polished, untouchable patriarch was gone. He looked his age, gray and terrified, wiping sweat from his forehead. Jamal sat heavily on the leather sofa, staring at his incessantly vibrating smartphone. His screen lit up over and over again with messages from angry investors demanding the liquidity he had promised them by the end of the month. Jamal did not have the cash. He had spent the last of the incoming investments to lease the Aston Martin he drove to my grandmother's funeral. "The social media smear campaign is not working fast enough," Jamal snapped, tossing his phone onto the mahogany coffee table. "She is not reacting. She is not stepping down. My investors are breathing down my neck, Richard. If I do not inject $3 million into my accounts by next week, the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to start asking questions." My father stopped pacing and gripped the back of a leather chair. "I am out of time, Jamal. The bank sent another foreclosure notice this morning. If Blair liquidates the estate and puts the assets into a blind trust like her lawyer threatened, we get nothing. We lose the house. We lose the business. We lose everything. They realized in that suffocating, dimly lit room that public shaming was a useless weapon against someone who refused to feel shame. They needed a legal mechanism. The probate court would not remove an appointed executor just because of a few tearful videos posted by a jealous sister. The court required hard, undeniable proof of incapacity. They needed to legally demonstrate that I was entirely unfit to manage a $12 million estate. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his mind racing through illegal alternatives. We need a paper trail, Richard. The judge will not listen to Madison crying. The judge will only listen to medical documentation. We need to prove she is out of her mind. We need to validate the addiction story you sold to the family 12 years ago. My father stared at the empty fireplace, his moral compass completely overridden by his sheer financial terror. He remembered the panic attack. He remembered the orange prescription bottle he had weaponized to kick me out of the house. He knew there was no actual history of severe substance abuse. He knew there were no real rehab records because I had never been to rehab. But a desperate man facing total ruin does not care about reality. He cares about survival. His entire existence depended on stealing my inheritance to cover his tracks. He turned to face his son-in-law, his eyes cold and devoid of any paternal instinct. The decision was made in an instant. We need to prove she is unfit. Get me those rehab documents. We will make them ourselves if we have to. Jamal did not waste a single second. The very next morning, he locked the doors to his downtown corner office, closed the motorized blinds, and booted up his personal encrypted laptop. He was a man fighting for his life, and he needed a weapon that would completely obliterate my credibility. He opened the digital registry of his offshore accounts. Among the tangled web of fraudulent investments and empty portfolios, he located exactly what he needed. It was a dormant, limited liability company registered in Delaware, originally set up to funnel phantom real estate investments. With a few rapid keystrokes, he altered the doing business as classification. In less than 10 minutes, that empty corporate shell was officially rebranded as Oakwood Serenity Center. Jamal downloaded standard medical billing templates from the internet. He poured a fresh cup of coffee and began meticulously crafting a fictional nightmare. He typed out admission dates, diagnostic codes, and discharge summaries. He did not hold back. He documented 30-day involuntary psychiatric holds. He listed treatments for severe narcotic withdrawals. He fabricated notes about erratic aggressive behavior and refusal to comply with outpatient therapy. He attached exorbitant billing amounts to the invoices, ensuring they looked like the authentic crushing expenses of a high-end private rehabilitation facility. He printed the documents on thick, expensive linen paper to give them the physical weight of absolute authority. When he handed the freshly printed stack of lies to my father later that afternoon, Richard did not ask questions. Richard did not express a single ounce of hesitation about committing massive multi-layered fraud against his own flesh and blood. My father simply looked at the crisp invoices, his eyes gleaming with the desperate relief of a man who just found a loaded gun. They wasted no time. Less than 48 hours after the reading of my grandmother's will, Richard and Jamal walked through the heavy double doors of the Massachusetts probate court. They wore their sharpest power suits, projecting the image of deeply concerned wealthy family members forced to take drastic action. They marched right up to the clerk's window and officially filed an emergency injunction to halt the execution of the estate. My father stood before the intake clerk and delivered a masterful, tragic performance. He claimed that a $12 million estate was in imminent danger of being liquidated to fund a lethal drug habit. He submitted the forged Oakwood Serenity Center invoices as Exhibits A through D, demanding an expedited hearing to strip me of my executor duties and transfer total control of the assets back to him. Walking out of the courthouse, they felt absolutely invincible. Richard immediately called Madison, instructing her to start practicing her victim routine for the witness stand. They laughed in the courthouse parking lot, entirely convinced of their own brilliant supremacy. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted the legal system. They pictured me as the exact same terrified, isolated 22-year-old girl they had thrown onto the streets 12 years ago. They thought I was sitting alone in a cheap apartment, completely defenseless, lacking the resources or the mental fortitude to fight back against a tidal wave of medical evidence. They thought they had cornered a helpless, estranged daughter. 2 days later, I was sitting at my heavy oak desk in my home office, cross-referencing a series of offshore wire transfers on my federal terminal. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from my front door. I locked my screen, walked down the hallway, and opened the door to find a licensed process server standing on my porch. He asked to confirm my identity, handed me a thick manila envelope, and quickly walked away. I closed the door, carried the envelope back to my office, and sat down. I broke the red legal seal and pulled out the emergency injunction. I saw my father's name listed as the plaintiff. I saw the aggressive legal demands to freeze my grandmother's estate. And then I flipped to the attached exhibits. I stared at the heavy linen paper bearing the logo of Oakwood Serenity Center. I read through the fabricated descriptions of my supposed psychotic breaks and narcotic withdrawals. Most people would have felt a sudden, suffocating wave of panic. Most people would have immediately called a defense attorney in tears, terrified that a judge might actually believe the lies printed on those pages. I did not feel fear. I felt a deep, profound sense of amusement. I did not just read the medical descriptions, I audited the document. My eyes bypassed the fake diagnostics and locked directly onto the corporate header. I saw the billing address. I saw the routing information listed at the bottom of the invoice for payment processing. Most importantly, I saw the employer identification number printed in tiny, unassuming text in the bottom corner of the page. I turned to my computer, unlocked my federal database terminal, and typed that exact 9-digit number into the search bar. I hit enter. The screen flashed as the algorithm connected the dots. The Delaware Limited Liability Company, posing as Oakwood Serenity Center, was not just a random fake business. It was the exact central node of Jamal's financial laundering network. It was the primary shell corporation he used to funnel money from his new investors to pay off the old ones. The federal task force I contracted with had been hunting for the specific corporate entity holding Jamal's fraudulent assets for 6 months. He had hidden it so well behind layers of digital red tape that we could not definitively tie it to his name. But Jamal, in his infinite arrogance and desperate need to destroy me in probate court, had just printed out the exact location of his criminal empire, signed it, and submitted it into the public legal record. He had handed me the smoking gun on a silver platter. I leaned back in my leather chair. A slow, cold smile spread across my face as I looked at the forged medical bills. My family had tried to forge a blade to cut my throat, but they had just handed me the executioner's sword. I picked up my secure encrypted mobile phone. I dialed a direct line that bypassed standard government switchboards. The line clicked open after a single ring. "Hey, boss. I found the dummy corporation we have been looking for." The harsh fluorescent lights of the Massachusetts probate court brought us right back to the present moment. The heavy air in the room was completely still. I stood in the center aisle, holding the silent, captivated attention of every single person in the gallery. My brief clarification regarding the 12-year-old bank statement had already cracked the foundation of their carefully constructed lie. Now it was time to bring down the entire house. My father Richard was gripping the edge of the plaintiff table. His knuckles were bone white against the dark mahogany wood. He was breathing heavily through his nose, his mind desperately trying to process how the narrative he had controlled for over a decade was suddenly slipping through his fingers. He had walked into this building expecting an effortless slaughter. He expected to easily crush a fragile, estranged daughter. Instead, he was staring at a woman made of absolute stone. My court-appointed attorney, the man who had been sweating through his collar just 20 minutes ago, finally understood the dynamic of the room. He realized I was not a terrified civilian buckling under the weight of fabricated medical bills. He straightened his posture, cleared his throat, and took a formal, highly deliberate step backward. He looked up at the high bench. "Your Honor." My attorney announced, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "My client will not just be offering a personal rebuttal today. My client will now address the medical evidence submitted by the plaintiff directly as an expert witness." Richard's high-priced attorney shot up from his leather chair as if he had been physically struck by lightning. He slammed his hand flat against the table, his face twisted in absolute outrage. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an absolute mockery of probate procedure." The lawyer shouted, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. A pro se litigant cannot simply declare herself an expert witness to validate her own defense. The plaintiff has submitted certified medical invoices from a private rehabilitation facility. The defense is employing a ridiculous delay tactic. The woman standing before you is a data entry clerk, not a medical professional, and certainly not a recognized legal authority. Judge Sylvia Crawford did not even blink at the outburst. She raised her hand, silencing the panicked attorney instantly. She turned her piercing gaze back to me. The corners of her mouth tightened in a look of profound intrigue. She had presided over hundreds of bitter family disputes, but she knew exactly when the temperature in her courtroom fundamentally shifted. "I will hear her foundation counsel." The judge stated, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "If she wishes to submit her professional credentials to this court to qualify her testimony regarding these financial documents, I am fully prepared to review them." "Overruled. You may proceed." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I turned on my heel and walked back to my open briefcase resting on the defense table. Every eye in the gallery followed my movements. Madison sat rigid in the second row, her designer tissue crumpled into a tight, useless ball in her fist. Her performance as the grieving sister had entirely evaporated. Next to her, Jamal let out a harsh, dismissive breath, crossing his arms tightly over his broad chest. He was trying desperately to project dominance to maintain the illusion of the untouchable hedge fund manager. But the rapid, involuntary tapping of his expensive leather shoe against the floorboards betrayed his mounting anxiety. He was a fraud, and frauds possess a primal instinct for when they are being hunted. I bypassed the stacks of banking records and reached into a secure, hidden pocket of my briefcase. I pulled out a heavy, dark blue leather identification folio. The seal of the United States government was deeply embossed in gold on the front cover. I turned around and walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in absolute measured rhythm. I stopped at the wooden barrier and handed the folio to the armed bailiff. The bailiff glanced down at the gold seal. His eyebrows shot up in surprise before he quickly turned and placed it directly onto the judge's bench. The silence in the room became thick and suffocating. Richard stared at the blue leather folio, a deep, visceral fear finally beginning to fracture his arrogant facade. He looked over his shoulder at Jamal. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the judge. The dark, menacing glare he had used to intimidate me in my grandmother's study was gone. They both knew that basic data entry clerks did not carry government-issued identification badges. Judge Crawford flipped the leather folio open. She stared at the laminated credentials for a long, agonizing moment. Her eyes scanned the official department seals, the security holograms, and the federal identification numbers. A sharp, incredibly dangerous smirk briefly touched the corner of her lips. She looked up, completely ignoring Richard and his terrified lawyer. She looked straight at me, a profound, unspoken, mutual respect passing between us. She recognized exactly what kind of predator was standing in her courtroom. The judge picked up the credential card, holding it, so the court reporter could properly document the official record. She read the title out loud, her voice ringing with absolute crushing authority across the silent room. Senior Forensic Auditor, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, Internal Revenue Service. The sound of my father's jaw dropping was practically audible. All the color drained from his face as he stumbled backward, bumping heavily into his chair. In the gallery, Jamal visibly paled. The smooth, wealthy corporate persona he had meticulously crafted vanished into thin air. He gripped the wooden pew in front of him, staring at me with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the woman he tried to trap and bribe was the exact same federal agent who had been quietly tracking his illegal offshore accounts for the past 6 months. The absolute paralysis in the courtroom was a tangible, heavy thing. My father, a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling the narrative through sheer volume and intimidation, was completely mute. He stood frozen behind the heavy wooden table, his mouth slightly parted, his eyes darting frantically between my federal credentials on the bench and my face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the devastating pull of gravity. In the gallery, Jamal was no longer leaning back in his pew. The effortless, wealthy swagger he used to mask his profound insecurities had vanished. He was gripping the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the court so tightly that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. He knew exactly what the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network was. He knew that the people who carried those blue leather folios did not bother with petty domestic disputes. We dismantle cartels, we freeze global assets, and we put arrogant men in federal prison. I did not give them a single second to recover. I turned my attention away from their horrified faces and looked up at the large monitors mounted around the room. The projected image of the Oakwood Serenity Center medical invoice was still glaring in bright white against the screens. It was the document they thought would instantly strip me of my inheritance and brand me an incompetent addict for the rest of my life. I walked over to the plaintiff table. My father instinctively took a step back as I approached. I reached down and tapped the spacebar on his lawyer's laptop, highlighting the top half of the projected invoice. Your Honor. I began, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent room. As an expert witness in financial forensics, my job is not to diagnose medical conditions. My job is to verify the origin, transit, and destination of capital. When investigating suspected medical fraud, we do not look at the clinical notes. We look at the billing infrastructure. Criminals will spend days crafting the perfect fake psychiatric evaluation, but they always get lazy when it comes to the accounting metadata. I pointed directly at the top right corner of the projected document. Take a close look at this invoice, I instructed the court. At first glance, it appears to be a standard itemized medical bill from a high-end rehabilitation facility. The font is professional. The medical billing codes align with standard psychiatric care. But whoever drafted this document utilized a basic commercial invoicing software template. You can tell by the default spacing of the routing information at the bottom. A legitimate multi-million-dollar medical facility in Massachusetts would utilize a dedicated healthcare revenue cycle management system, which generates proprietary tracking barcodes. This document lacks any such barcode. My father's attorney was furiously wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked at the screen, then back at his client, a rising panic visible in his eyes. He had submitted these documents as certified evidence without running a basic due diligence check, blindly trusting that his wealthy client was providing legitimate records. But the software template is merely a formatting error. I continued pacing slowly back toward the center of the room. The true foundational failure of this document lies in its tax registration. I pointed to a string of 9 digits printed in tiny, unassuming text just beneath the facility's address. Every legally operating business in the United States must register for an employer identification number. It is the digital fingerprint of a company. The EIN listed on this supposedly prestigious Massachusetts medical facility begins with the digits 2 and 0. However, medical facilities registered and operating exclusively within this state are assigned different regional prefixes by the Internal Revenue Service. I paused, letting the weight of the technical failure sink in. I looked directly at Jamal. His chest was heaving. He was staring at the screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He was a man watching his entire life disintegrate in front of his eyes. A prefix of 20 indicates a corporate entity registered in the state of Delaware, I stated. Delaware is widely known as a corporate tax haven frequently utilized to establish anonymous shell companies and blind limited liability corporations. It is the absolute preferred registration state for individuals looking to hide assets or generate untraceable corporate paper trails. I walked back to my briefcase on the defense table. I reached inside and pulled out a thick spiral-bound document featuring the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. I handed it to the bailiff, who immediately passed it up to Judge Crawford. The judge opened the bound report, her eyes scanning the highly classified federal data. I ran that specific employer identification number through our restricted federal registry, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on the judge. The query confirmed that Oakwood Serenity Center does not hold a single medical license. It employs no doctors, no nurses, and no psychiatric staff. It has never filed a healthcare tax return. I turned slowly on my heel, facing the plaintiff side of the room. I looked right past my father and locked eyes with my brother-in-law. Jamal tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. Madison was looking back and forth between her husband and me, her fabricated tears completely forgotten, replaced by a very real, very raw confusion. "Your Honor, this rehab facility doesn't exist," I said, my voice echoing with absolute crushing finality. "It is a registered LLC in Delaware. It is a phantom corporation created solely to generate a fake paper trail. And if you look at page 2 of my audit, the registered agent for this LLC is Jamal." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps. Extended family members in the back rows began whispering furiously. Madison grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She demanded to know why his name was on the federal audit. Jamal yanked his arm away from her, stumbling backward until his spine hit the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. He was trapped. I did not let him breathe. I took 3 deliberate steps toward the gallery barrier, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from the man who had tried to intimidate me in my grandmother's study. I looked at him with the cold, ruthless precision of an executioner. "You just submitted forged documents to a federal court, Jamal." I said, my words dropping like anvils onto the floor. "That is perjury and falsifying evidence. That carries a 5-year minimum." The absolute terror paralyzing Jamal was a localized event contained entirely within the back corner of the courtroom. Up at the plaintiff table, my father was experiencing a completely different, much more volatile reaction. The cognitive dissonance of watching his bulletproof plan disintegrate into a federal crime was too much for his arrogant mind to process. Richard could not accept that he had been outsmarted. He could not process that the daughter he had discarded like trash was currently holding his freedom in the palm of her hand. Richard slammed both of his hands flat against the mahogany table, his face twisting into a mask of purple, unhinged fury. "She hacked us," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger across the aisle at me. "Your Honor, this is a severe invasion of privacy. She is a cyber criminal. She used her government clearance to illegally breach our private networks. You cannot admit any of this into evidence. She stole this information to orchestrate a personal vendetta against her own family." His voice echoed wildly, but it lacked any real authority. It was the frantic, high-pitched screeching of a man drowning in his own lies. Judge Sylvia Crawford did not strike her gavel. She did not yell back. She simply stared down at my father with an expression of profound, chilling exhaustion. She looked at him the way one looks at a rabid animal that has trapped itself in a snare. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not even look at him. I simply turned on my heel, walked back to my open leather briefcase, resting on the defense table, and reached inside for the second time. "I do not hack, Richard," I stated, my voice projecting with calm, devastating clarity. "Federal auditors do not need to steal your passwords or break into your personal computers. We issue federal subpoenas. We trace the digital footprint of the money you move through public banking institutions. And when a supposedly wealthy businessman tries to claim a $12 million estate using forged medical documents, it triggers an automatic mandatory review of his personal and corporate finances by the Department of the Treasury." I pulled out a second folder. Unlike the thin file containing the fake rehab bills, this folder was incredibly thick, bound with a heavy black spine. It contained months of meticulous, undeniable forensic accounting. I walked across the center aisle, stepping directly into my father's personal space. He flinched instinctively, taking a step backward as I dropped the heavy black binder directly onto the plaintiff table right in front of his high-priced attorney. The sound of the binder hitting the wood landed with a heavy, sickening thud. "Let us talk about your business, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Let us talk about the real reason you are standing in this courtroom today, throwing your own daughter under the bus." Richard tried to open his mouth, tried to summon another wave of righteous indignation, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The color drained out of his face, leaving him looking hollow and deeply aged. "You are not fighting for this estate to preserve Grandma's legacy." I continued, my voice stripping away the final layers of his carefully constructed country club facade. "Your manufacturing firm is bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. You have 3 leveraged mortgages. You maxed out your corporate credit lines 6 months ago. But instead of filing for bankruptcy like a responsible business owner, you decided to maintain your wealthy lifestyle using funds that did not belong to you." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Extended family members, the same people who had blindly believed his lies about my addiction, were now staring at the back of his head in absolute horror. "You need this $12 million estate because you have been embezzling your employees' 401k pension funds for 3 years," I announced to the silent courtroom. My father gripped the edge of the table, his knees visibly buckling under the weight of the accusation. "You stopped matching their retirement contributions 36 months ago," I explained, laying out the mechanics of his massive fraud for the judge to hear. "Then when the creditors started calling you, went further. You created a shadow account. You began siphoning the principal balances directly out of the retirement portfolios of the men and women who have worked on your factory floor for decades. You stole their life savings to pay for your country club dues, the leases on your luxury vehicles, and your extravagant dinners." I pointed to the heavy black binder resting on the table. "Every single illegal wire transfer is documented right there, certified by the Internal Revenue Service and cross-referenced with the Department of Labor." Richard slowly turned his head to look at his attorney. He was begging for help, begging for a legal objection, begging for any possible lifeline to pull him out of the federal nightmare I had just dragged him into. "Do something," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with absolute despair. "You have to object. Tell the judge this is inadmissible." But his attorney was not looking at him. The lawyer, a man who charged $800 an hour and valued his license to practice law far more than any single client, had flipped open the heavy black binder. He was staring at the certified federal traces. He saw the official seals. He saw the undeniable, perfectly mapped paper trail, proving that his client was running a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. More importantly, the lawyer realized the catastrophic reality of his own situation. He had just stood before a strict probate judge and officially submitted forged medical documents on behalf of a man who was about to be indicted for massive federal fraud. He had been played for a fool, and he was now standing in the blast radius of a federal crime. The lawyer did not object. He did not defend my father. He slowly closed the black binder, letting his hand rest on top of the cover for a brief second. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at me. He looked directly up at Judge Crawford. He reached down, grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, and snapped the brass lock shut with 2 loud, sharp clicks. He picked up his coat, stepped entirely away from my father, and cleared his throat. "Your Honor!" The lawyer stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I must withdraw as counsel for Mr. Hayes, effective immediately." The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind my father's former attorney, sealing Richard inside his own self-made tomb. The resounding thud of the closing door acted like a physical blow to my sister. Up until this exact second, Madison had clung to the delusion that our father was invincible. She had spent her entire adult life insulated by his stolen wealth, believing that money and a country club membership could buy their way out of any consequence. Now, watching a high-powered attorney flee the room to save his own license, reality violently crashed down upon her. Madison scrambled to her feet. The carefully rehearsed posture, the designer grief, the elegant mourning veil, it all completely disintegrated. She gripped the polished wood of the gallery pew, her knuckles white, her face distorted in genuine ugly panic. "Make her stop!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking as she looked wildly up at the bench. "Your Honor! You have to stop her. She is insane. She is making all of this up to destroy our family. She is a sick, jealous woman." Judge Sylvia Crawford did not strike her gavel. She did not even offer Madison the dignity of a verbal response. The judge simply stared down at my sister with an expression of chilling indifference, letting Madison's hysterical cries echo pointlessly against the marble walls. The absolute silence from the bench was a devastating confirmation. The court was no longer entertaining their lies. While Madison was busy having a public meltdown, her husband was silently calculating his own survival. I kept my eyes locked on the gallery, watching the flawless execution of a coward's retreat. Jamal did not comfort his screaming wife. He did not step forward to defend my father. He realized that the federal audit sitting on the plaintiff table was just the tip of the spear. If I had meticulously tracked Richard's pension embezzlement, Jamal knew with absolute certainty that his own offshore financial networks were completely exposed. He needed to run. He needed to get to his leased Aston Martin drive to the airport and board the first international flight available before the federal indictments dropped. Moving with slow, terrifying stealth, Jamal released his grip on Madison's arm. He slid quietly along the back of the wooden pew, stepping backward into the shadows of the courtroom's rear aisle. He kept his head down, taking careful, measured steps toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. He was just 5 feet away from the exit. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly as his fingers brushed the cold brass handle. "Bailiff, please ensure the doors remain closed." Judge Crawford's voice cut through the room like a crack of a whip. The command was sharp, absolute, and instantly lethal to Jamal's escape plan. The armed bailiff, who had been watching Jamal's suspicious movements for the past 60 seconds, stepped squarely in front of the double doors. He rested his hand casually on his utility belt and shifted his weight, completely blocking the exit. The loud metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the silent courtroom. Jamal froze, his hands suspended in midair. The illusion of the untouchable Wall Street titan completely shattered. He slowly turned around, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror. He was trapped in a locked federal courtroom with the exact person who had mapped out his entire criminal existence. I did not offer him a single second to formulate a lie. I turned my back on my hyperventilating sister and my catatonic father. I walked to the defense table one final time. I reached into the depths of my leather briefcase and pulled out the third folder. This folder was not thin like the medical bills. It was not bound like my father's embezzlement audit. It was a massive, overflowing accordion file, heavily stuffed with hundreds of pages of federal tracking data, offshore wire intercepts, and decrypted client ledgers. I carried it across the room and dropped it onto the table. The sheer weight of the file hit the solid wood with a deafening, conclusive slam. "We are not finished," I announced, turning my body so I was facing Jamal directly. My father was not the only person in this room attempting to use my grandmother's estate as a personal bailout. I looked up at the bench. "Your Honor, the man standing at the back of your courtroom, Jamal Davis, presents himself to the public as a high-yield hedge fund manager. He claims to handle aggressive elite portfolios for a highly exclusive list of private investors. He uses this fabricated prestige to intimidate his family and solicit funds from unsuspecting victims." I placed my hand flat on top of the massive file. "But Jamal's hedge fund has absolutely no investments," I stated, my voice echoing with ruthless precision. "He holds no equities. He holds no municipal bonds. He owns no commercial real estate. It is a classic textbook Ponzi scheme." Jamal opened his mouth, desperately trying to pull oxygen into his lungs, but he was completely paralyzed. Madison stopped crying. She slowly turned around to look at her husband, her face completely drained of color as the words washed over her. "He established a network of phantom limited liability companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands." I continued outlining the exact architecture of his fraud for the court reporter to document. He targeted local doctors, retired lawyers, and small business owners. He took their capital under the guise of high-yield returns. But he never invested a single dime. He simply used the money from his newest investors to pay the fabricated quarterly dividends of his older investors. I took a step towards the center aisle, closing the distance between myself and the man who had tried to physically intimidate me in my grandmother's study. "The rest of the capital was siphoned directly into his personal checking accounts," I said, staring dead into Jamal's panicked eyes. "He used stolen money to lease luxury cars, buy tailored suits, and purchase a fake Daytona Rolex. But the influx of new investors has completely dried up. The fraudulent accounts are entirely drained. And right now, there is a hard, undeniable $4 million deficit. Madison let out a quiet, horrified gasp. She stared at Jamal, stepping away from him as if he were suddenly highly contagious. Her entire life of luxury, the country club memberships, the designer dresses, the extravagant vacations, it was all funded by a massive federal crime. She was married to a man who was about to spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. Jamal shook his head frantically. He raised his hands, trying to form a coherent sentence, trying to deny the suffocating mountain of evidence resting on the table. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit that no longer existed. He was a rat caught in a steel trap, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Before he could utter a single word of defense, the thick, heavy silence of the courtroom was suddenly pierced by a sound originating from the Boston streets outside. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance. Within seconds it grew louder, multiplying and echoing off the concrete buildings of the financial district. The sound bled through the thick, reinforced glass windows of the courthouse, completely unmistakable in its urgency. Sirens. Multiple sirens screaming through the city traffic, drawing closer and closer to the front steps of the probate court. The wail of the sirens grew deafening, bouncing off the historic brick facades of the surrounding financial district. Red and blue lights began to pulse fiercely through the tall frosted windows of the courtroom, casting a frantic strobing glow across the pale, terrified faces of my family. The reality of the situation was no longer a theoretical audit or a threat on paper. The federal government had officially arrived. I turned my attention to Madison, the golden child, the sister who had spent 31 years floating on a cloud of unearned privilege, looking down on me, mocking my struggles, and wearing my stolen college fund like a badge of absolute honor. In a matter of minutes, I had systematically dismantled every single pillar of her existence. Her father was a desperate embezzler. Her husband was a fraudulent criminal. Her entire life of luxury was a complete fabricated lie built on the broken backs of innocent factory workers and deceived investors. The shock gave way to absolute primal humiliation. Madison slowly backed away from the heavy wooden doors. She looked at Jamal, her eyes scanning his expensive tailored suit, the fake gold watch, the polished shoes, and she finally saw the hollow, terrifying void hiding underneath. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The country club memberships, the luxury vacations in Europe, the endless shopping sprees, all of it was funded by stolen money. She was not a high society elite married to a financial genius. She was the unwitting accomplice to a massive federal crime syndicate. Madison completely snapped. A high-pitched, agonizing scream tore from her throat as she lunged at Jamal. She did not care about the judge sitting on the bench. She did not care about the armed bailiff standing just a few feet away. She slammed her open hands directly into Jamal's chest, hitting him with a wild, unhinged fury. "You said we were rich," she shrieked, her voice echoing violently in the enclosed, echoing space. "You promised me the summer house. You lied to me. You are nothing but a cheap, pathetic fraud." Jamal staggered backward under the sudden weight of her physical assault, but his sheer panic instantly morphed into vicious, defensive anger. The suave, supportive husband act dissolved completely into thin air. He grabbed Madison by the wrists, his grip punishingly tight, and shoved her backward with a harsh, aggressive thrust. "Get off me!" Jamal roared, his face contorted with absolute rage. "You love the money, Madison. You never once asked where the cash for your designer bags came from as long as the credit cards cleared. Do not stand here and play the innocent victim now. You spent the money just as fast as I could steal it." My father, who had been standing paralyzed behind the plaintiff table, suddenly snapped out of his catatonic state. Seeing Jamal physically push his golden child ignited a frantic, desperate need to deflect the blame away from his own staggering crimes. Richard lunged across the center aisle, pointing a shaking finger directly at Jamal's face. "You dragged my family into this!" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You used my business connections to funnel your dirty money. You manipulated my daughter. I will tell the federal agents everything. I will testify against you to the Securities and Exchange Commission to save myself." Jamal let out a harsh barking laugh, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You are going to testify against me," Jamal shouted right back, stepping aggressively toward my father, completely abandoning any remaining shred of respect. "You are the one who stole your own employees' pension funds, Richard. You forged medical documents and submitted them to a federal court. You are drowning in debt and looking for a scapegoat. I will hand you over to the feds on a silver platter to cut my own plea deal." I stood silently by the defense table, adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket. I watched the beautiful, perfect family tear each other apart like rabid dogs fighting over a scrap of poisoned meat. There was no loyalty. There was no unconditional love. There was no familial bond protecting them from the storm. The exact second the money dried up and the very real threat of federal prison became imminent, they turned on each other with a breathtaking level of viciousness. They were entirely willing to sacrifice anyone and everyone in the room just to save their own skin. I did not have to raise my voice. I did not have to throw a single punch. I did not have to post a tearful video on social media begging for sympathy. I just provided the absolute truth, and the truth was burning their entire world to the ground in real time. The screaming match between Richard, Jamal, and Madison devolved into pure, incoherent chaos. Madison collapsed onto the floor of the gallery, sobbing hysterically into her hands as the flashing police lights illuminated her ruined designer dress. Richard and Jamal were standing inches apart, hurling threats of federal cooperation and prison time at each other, entirely forgetting that the judge was still sitting right above them. The sharp, explosive crack of a wooden gavel sliced through the madness like a physical strike. Judge Sylvia Crawford stood up behind the heavy mahogany bench. She struck the sounding block a second time, hitting it so hard the sharp sound reverberated like a gunshot across the marble floor. The screaming instantly ceased. Jamal snapped his mouth shut. Richard froze mid-sentence. The room fell into a heavy, terrified silence, broken only by Madison's ragged, gasping sobs and the wailing sirens just outside the courthouse walls. Judge Crawford looked down at the pathetic, broken men standing in her courtroom. Her expression was a mask of absolute, unyielding authority. She pointed her wooden gavel directly at my father and my brother-in-law. "Richard and Jamal, you are ordered to remain in this courtroom." Judge Crawford commanded, her voice carrying the crushing, undeniable weight of the justice system. "The authorities are waiting outside." The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a forceful, commanding thud. The blinding red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles parked directly outside the courthouse spilled into the room, cutting through the stagnant, suffocated air of the gallery. 4 individuals stepped across the threshold, moving with the synchronized, predatory efficiency of people who dismantle lives for a living. They wore crisp, dark windbreakers, bearing the stark, unmistakable yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by a senior agent from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They did not pause to survey the room. They did not wait for an invitation. Judge Sylvia Crawford gave a single firm nod from the bench, giving the federal agents absolute jurisdiction over her courtroom. The lead agent bypassed the gallery entirely, marching straight toward the defense table, where Jamal was still backed against the wooden barrier. Jamal tried to instinctively smooth his silk tie, a pathetic muscle memory attempt to project the authority of a high-net-worth individual. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, plastering a desperate, charming smile onto his sweating face. He actually thought he could talk his way out of a federal indictment. "Agents, there has been some massive misunderstanding here today." Jamal started, his voice shaking as he attempted to utilize his corporate pitch voice. "My financial portfolios are simply undergoing a routine liquidity transition. If we can just step outside and discuss this like rational business professionals, I can easily clarify the accounting discrepancies." The lead federal agent completely ignored the smooth-talking facade. He did not slow his pace. He did not negotiate. He reached to his utility belt, drew a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, and grabbed Jamal by the left wrist. Jamal Davis, the agent, stated, his voice ringing with absolute, uncompromising authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and perjury before a court of law. You have the right to remain silent." The metallic, heavy snap of the handcuffs closing around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly across the marble floor. the cold steel pressed directly against the fake gold Daytona Rolex he was wearing. The sheer humiliation of the moment was absolute. The arrogant, untouchable hedge fund manager who had tried to physically intimidate me in my grandmother's locked study was now being forcefully spun around. His hands secured tightly behind his back, stripped of every single ounce of his fabricated power. While two agents escorted a pale, silent Jamal out of the courtroom, the remaining two agents flanked the plaintiff table. My father was hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically beneath his custom navy suit. He looked wildly around the room for his attorney, completely forgetting that his high-priced legal counsel had already sprinted out of the building to save his own license. Richard Hayes, the IRS criminal investigator, said, stepping directly into my father's personal space. You are not currently under arrest, but you are being officially detained for formal questioning by the Department of Labor and federal tax authorities regarding the systemic embezzlement of corporate pension funds and international wire fraud. Do not attempt to leave this building. The last remaining pillar of my father's ego completely shattered. The wealthy, untouchable country club patriarch died in that exact second. Richard looked up at Judge Crawford, but the judge was already organizing her paperwork, her face a mask of absolute indifference to his plight. She had no sympathy for men who stole from their own employees. Then Richard looked across the center aisle. He looked at me. The man who had spent the last 12 years telling his high society friends that I was a worthless, drug-addicted failure, suddenly realized that I was the only person left in the room who held any actual power. He realized that the daughter he had thrown onto the freezing streets with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes was now a senior federal auditor and the sole executor of a $12 million empire. Richard did not walk across the center aisle. He stumbled. His legs simply gave out beneath him, buckling under the crushing weight of his impending federal prison sentence. He collapsed onto the hard, cold marble floor directly at my feet. He fell to his knees, dropping his head in total pathetic submission. He reached out with trembling, profusely sweating hands and physically grabbed the immaculate fabric of my tailored charcoal skirt. He clung to me like a drowning man clinging to the side of a life raft. "Blair, please," my father begged. His voice was a high-pitched, agonizing whine that sounded absolutely nothing like the roaring, furious man who had slammed his fist on the table just an hour ago. "I am your father. You cannot let them take me away. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it is a family misunderstanding. We can share the estate, Blair. We can split the $12 million. I will give you whatever you want. Just tell them to stop the investigation." Before I could even process the breathtaking audacity of him offering to share an estate, that he legally had absolutely no claim to, another voice joined the pathetic chorus. From the floor of the gallery, Madison crawled desperately toward the wooden barrier dividing us. Her pristine high society image was completely destroyed. Thick black rivers of mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her expensive designer dress. She gripped the wooden slats of the barrier, her knuckles white, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated terror. She had just watched the federal government place her husband in handcuffs. She knew all of her bank accounts, her credit cards, and her assets were about to be frozen by the Department of Justice. Blair Madison sobbed, her voice cracking as she reached a shaking hand through the wooden barrier toward me. "He lied to me. Jamal took everything we had. I do not have a single dollar to my name. They are going to take my house. They are going to take my car. Please, Blair, you have $12 million now. Just give me enough cash to hire a high-profile divorce lawyer. I am your sister. You have to help me. You cannot leave me with nothing." I stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom. The air around me felt incredibly clear, crisp, and entirely devoid of any emotional static. I looked down at the two people sobbing at my feet. I looked at the father who stole my $40,000 college fund to pay for country club catering, leaving me to sleep in a transit station utility closet. I looked at the sister who had happily danced in a $15,000 dress funded by my stolen education, the same sister who had posted tearful videos on the internet just yesterday, trying to brand me a psychotic addict. They were begging for mercy. They were invoking the sacred bonds of family, hoping that the very concept of blood loyalty they had weaponized against me for over a decade would somehow miraculously save them from the consequences of their own malicious greed. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of sadness, guilt, or familial obligation. I felt nothing but cold, absolute calculating clarity. I slowly reached down toward the hem of my skirt. I placed my hands over my father's trembling, sweaty wrists. With absolute methodical precision, I pried his desperate fingers off the immaculate fabric of my suit, peeling his grip away one finger at a time. I stepped back, smoothing out the perfectly pressed charcoal wool, preserving my space and my boundaries. I looked down at the people who had deliberately and viciously ruined my early 20s, preparing to deliver the final, inescapable truth. I looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the cold marble floor. Richard was gasping for air, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He had spent his entire life building an empire of lies, funding his country club existence with stolen pension money and my liquidated college fund. Now, staring down the barrel of federal prison, he wanted to negotiate. He wanted to split an inheritance he had absolutely no legal right to touch. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that echoed clearly across the silent courtroom. "Share the estate with you?" I asked, my tone dripping with absolute ice. "You do not have an estate to share, Richard. You do not have a business. You do not have a reputation. The federal government is about to seize every single asset you falsely claimed as your own. You are going to be stripped down to nothing." He opened his mouth to beg again, but I cut him off instantly. "12 years ago, you stood in your lavish living room and put on a magnificent performance," I reminded him, forcing him to confront the exact moment he sealed his own fate. "You held up a plastic bottle of anxiety medication, branded me a junkie, and threw me onto the freezing streets. You looked me dead in the eye and told me to never show my face in your family again." I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between my pristine suit and his trembling hands. "Do not worry, Richard," I stated, delivering the final, inescapable blow. "Where you are going, I will not be visiting." The federal agent stepped forward, grabbing my father by the shoulders and hauling him roughly to his feet. Richard went entirely limp, his spirit completely broken, offering zero resistance as the agent escorted him toward the side holding room. I turned my attention to the wooden barrier separating the court from the gallery. Madison was still gripping the railing, her face streaked with heavy black mascara. She was waiting for me to hand her a financial lifeline. She expected me to write her a blank check because we shared the same bloodline. She thought her fabricated tears would somehow miraculously erase a lifetime of entitlement and cruelty. "You want money for a high-profile divorce lawyer?" I asked, walking slowly toward my sister. "You want me to fund your legal defense using the exact same estate you just spent 3 weeks trying to steal from me?" Madison nodded frantically, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she gasped. "I have nothing left. Jamal took everything. I do not even have a way to pay the mortgage on my house next month." I let out a short, sharp breath of amusement. The sheer ignorance of my sister was truly staggering. She had spent her entire adult life playing the role of a wealthy socialite without ever bothering to understand how her own finances actually worked. "You do not have a mortgage, Madison," I explained, watching the confusion wash over her tear-stained face. "The sprawling mansion you live in was not purchased by Jamal. It was not funded by his fraudulent hedge fund. Grandma Beatrice bought that property in cash 5 years ago to ensure you would not end up homeless when Jamal inevitably ruined himself." Madison let out a small, relieved sigh, falsely assuming she was safe. She thought she still had her luxurious suburban fortress. She was entirely wrong. She purchased the property using a blind corporate trust. I continued, shattering her fleeting moment of relief. "And as Mr. Caldwell announced 30 minutes ago, I am the sole absolute executor of her entire estate. That includes every single corporate trust she established." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice so only she could hear the absolute finality in my words. "The house you live in, Grandma bought it under a trust. I am the executor of that trust. You have 30 days to vacate my property." Madison let out a devastating, breathless sob. Her knees buckled and she collapsed entirely against the wooden barrier, sliding down to the floor of the gallery. She had nothing. No husband, no money, no house, and absolutely no family left to manipulate. I turned my back on her and walked confidently up the center aisle toward the bench. Judge Sylvia Crawford was watching me with a look of profound, quiet respect. The federal agents had cleared the room of the criminals, leaving only the necessary court personnel. The oppressive, toxic energy that my family had brought into the courthouse was completely gone. The judge gave a single firm nod to her clerk. The clerk stepped forward and handed me the final heavy stack of probate documents. These were the papers that officially cemented my status as the executor and sole inheritor of the $12 million estate. I retrieved my sleek silver pen from my briefcase. I did not hesitate. I signed my name on the dotted lines with smooth, sweeping strokes, permanently securing my grandmother's legacy and my own financial empire. I handed the documents back to the clerk. Judge Crawford picked up her wooden gavel. She struck the sounding block one final time. The loud, decisive crack echoed through the empty room, officially closing the case. It was done. I picked up my briefcase, buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, and walked out the heavy mahogany doors. I pushed through the main entrance of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp, beautiful afternoon. The sky over Massachusetts was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sun hit my face warm and incredibly bright. The plaza steps were absolute chaos. A swarm of local reporters and federal press correspondents had caught wind of the high-profile arrests. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Journalists shouted questions, pushing their microphones forward as heavily armed federal agents marched Jamal and Richard down the stone steps. I stood at the top of the stairs watching the two men who had tried to destroy my life, being forcefully shoved into the back of heavily armored black federal SUVs. They ducked their heads, attempting to hide their faces from the relentless camera lenses, but there was no escaping the absolute public humiliation. Their carefully constructed country club reputations were completely obliterated. I did not stay to watch the vehicles drive away. I walked past the media circus entirely unnoticed by the reporters who were too busy focusing on the fallen businessmen. I approached my sleek black SUV parked down the street. I unlocked the doors, tossed my briefcase onto the passenger seat, and gripped the leather steering wheel. I drove out of the city, leaving the towering skyscrapers and the suffocating memories of my family far behind me. I drove for an hour, taking the scenic route along the winding coastal highway. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, secluded cafe overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and absolute freedom. I ordered a simple black coffee and walked out to the empty wooden deck. The water stretched out endlessly toward the horizon, shimmering under the late afternoon sun. There was no one screaming. There was no one demanding my money. There was no one telling me I was a failure. I stood by the wooden railing, feeling the cool ocean breeze against my face. I raised my paper cup high into the air, holding it up toward the endless blue sky. We did it, Grandma. It was total, unrelenting victory. The most profound lesson from Blair's journey is that true security is never given, it is painstakingly built. When faced with absolute betrayal, Blair didn't waste energy begging for validation from those committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, she embraced the silent grind. By stepping away from toxic noise and quietly mastering her craft, she forged an impenetrable armor of financial and professional independence. This story teaches us that walking away isn't giving up, it is taking your power back. Unrelenting success is the ultimate justice. Have you ever had to walk away to find your own strength? Share your experience in the comments below.